So there's this, I think in your book, you describe it as there's a survival cost to these displays, but there's a reproductive benefit, right? It's not obvious that why would the peacock expend all this energy in these large, showy tail feathers, but it's because it's increasing his chances for reproduction. So I've been talking to John Vervaeke recently. Do you know who that is?
Sort of vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, he's a University of Toronto psychologist, and he has this YouTube lecture series. But one thing that just popped into mind as you were saying that is he describes our capacity for adaptation is premised on the same, I guess it's genetic and biological machinery that can lead us to self-deception as well. And I think some of your work tied into this. We're saying humans developed the ability to be an ideological animal as part of this, right? Like it was a reproductive fitness feature, but it also has opened us up to be, it's not necessarily intended to map to truth. It's intended to map for attention grabbing. I think that's roughly right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the crazy thing about signaling, and it really took me like a decade to wrap my head around this fully. The crazy thing about signaling is there is a lot of truth being conveyed, but it's typically not truth about the content of the signal. It's usually truth about the quality of the signaler. Okay. So there's a big difference. For example, if you look at luxury goods being advertised through expensive commercials, what an expensive like commercial for a luxury car or watch or fashion, will include is typically a whole bunch of like either false or unfalsifiable just kind of associations, like here's an aspirational lifestyle, and if you buy our stuff, then you will enter into this like rarefied zone of success and amazing mates and an amazing lifestyle. And if you ask, is that even a truth claim? Not really, but the cost of the ad is the point. If a company like, Tesla or Rolex or Fendi or Prada can afford really good models, really good directors, really high production values, great lighting, great locations, that kind of testifies to the quality and longevity and reputability of the company. And so that's advertising, right? Yeah. And the peacock's tail is similar. Like the peacock's tail is just iridescent blue and green, radially symmetric eye spots that are large. They're not really conveying information. Like the peacock's tail is not making like a philosophical argument in a text form. Yes. It's simply saying, I'm the kind of peacock that can afford a big, bright, colorful tail. If I was sick or starving or had too many mutations, I would not be able to afford this tail.
Right.
So it's kind of a truth claim about the peacock's genes and its body and its energy level.
Now, this is interesting because I think we can tie this into Bitcoin, actually. And tell me if I'm stretching the analogy too far, but it's almost like a form of biological proof of work, right? Exactly. It's saying that, I, as an organism, have obtained enough resources to satisfy my basic needs that I can afford the luxury of these showy peacock feathers. And from that same excess reservoir of, I guess, energy, for lack of a better term, I could support a large and healthy family and, guard a territory and all of these things. Is that approximately correct?
Yeah, totally. One of my favorite biologists is a guy, Israeli biologist, Amatz Zahavi. And Zahavi wrote this amazing book in, I think, 97 called The Handicap Principle, all about these kind of costly signaling principles. Why does the peacock's tail have to be so big and cumbersome? And Zahavi had a lot of analogies to modern human culture, including to advertising and to kind of ridiculous fashions and like, why do rich business people, at least back then in the 90s, wear bespoke, expensive Italian suits that are hand tailored? if, Zahavi was writing that book today, I'm sure he would have mentioned proof of work as a great example of costly signaling. I don't know quite what his take would have been on proof of stake or proof of history or other, ways that crypto tries to be credible. But certainly, I think there's a deep, deep link between costly signaling theory and certain ways that you kind of, validate blocks in blockchain in a way that is credible to everyone. And I think your series with Michael Saylor sort of dovetails very much with this point.
Yeah, I think so. And there's such an interesting connection there again between the economic and biological domain, because if we look at gold through that lens, clearly gold was valued based on the proof of work necessary to obtain it, right? It takes a lot of energy and time to go out and find this rare metal. But then we would also use that as a mechanism of display. We would ornament ourselves with gold, and that would become a tool to attract mates or get attention, I guess. Or it's a form of conspicuous consumption, isn't it? That's the same thing as the suits and sports cars and all these other things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's such deep, wonderful analogies, also between Zahavi's handicap principle and Thorsten Veblen's theory of the leisure class, where he talks about conspicuous consumption.
The Veblen good, right?
Yeah, the Veblen good. So basically, Veblen in the 1890s almost single-handedly invented costly signaling theory, and then like 80 years later, biologists kind of rediscover it and apply it to sexual selection and animal behavior, and then we psychologists kind of rediscovered that.
Yeah.
Another example, though, that's worth mentioning is Michael Spence, the economist in the 70s, talking about conspicuous credentials and why do people pay for elite college degrees, right? And that's another kind of proof of trait that you have the intelligence and conscientiousness and money to afford the degree, and the Harvard degree or Stanford degree, it doesn't necessarily carry information about what you learned when you were there.
Yeah.
But it carries a lot of information about your kind of like heritable intelligence and your hard work and maybe your family finances, et cetera. So I think there's like a wonderful kind of Venn diagram of like economics, biology, marketing, crypto, proof of work that still needs to be more fully explored, I think, because it still has a lot of big economic and social implications today.
Yes, agreed. So I have a bit of and this is not my theory, but it's a theory I've gathered from just some reading and research that I'll try to air it out here. First thing, I'd like to say something about the Veblen good you just brought up. So the definition of a Veblen good, as I understand it, is actually a good whose demand increases as its price increases, which is opposite from most other goods. So it's something that the more desired it is, the more desirous it becomes in a way. And I think we can define, or we could at least look at money is kind of one of the ultimate Veblen goods. If we're talking about gold or something like Bitcoin, because actually the more expensive Bitcoin becomes, the less risk it has associated with it, and the more likely it is to consume all other monies. The more fitness it has displayed, I guess, as the ultimate monetary technology. So I think that I just wanted to tie that in and define Veblen goods for the audience. But this connection between the biological and economic domain, I read this book called The Territorial Imperative. It's kind of an older book, but there's this biological impulse among most forms of life to be territorial, so to gain and keep territory, mostly for the purposes of reproduction. And my theory and the author's theory in the book and others is that actually human beings clearly were territorial. I don't think that's contested, but we express our territoriality through property rights, right? So and property we just consider as like the most basic form of property is yourself. You own your own time. You are self-owned. And then a secondary form of property is you can go out and take your time, energy, skills, talents, and combine it with different portions of nature to, plant a farm or build a house or make a wagon, whatever it is. And then you own that property. And the theory of capitalism, at least, is that you should now be able to trade that property with other self-owned people. And that's how we create wealth and the division of labor and so on. And that to me would also explain, so property rights then are how we've, I guess, abstracted this very innate biological impulse called the territorial imperative. It also explains to me how people, money then would be the ultimate property effectively, because it lays claim to every other property. You can take money as the most tradable asset and acquire anything else. It explains why people have why money has such a deep psychological significance to people, because it's getting to this very base level reptilian brain, I'm guessing, mind state. Have you thought about that much, property rights and territoriality?
Yeah, absolutely. So Robert Ardrey, I think back in the 60s, did that territorial imperative book. And, some of it was maybe a little simplistic, but I do think there's a deep sense of ownership that not just humans, but I think many animals have. And the reason is it kind of goes back to the Richard Dawkins concept of the extended phenotype, right? The phenotype is your kind of animal body and your brain itself, but your extended phenotype would include like your clothing and a nest that you make and a territory that you hold. And, if you're a spider, your web is your extended phenotype. If you're a beaver and you build a dam and you create a lake, that makes it easier to catch food, the lake is your extended phenotype.
Oh, okay.
And so I think human people as social primates certainly have this sense of like, this is my tribe, this is our territory, and we have a special claim to it. And where you get upset if someone infringes on your territory, just the way a spider in its tiny little spider brain would probably get kind of upset if you messed with its web.
Right.
It invested time and energy in making, or if some, invading, beaver couple took over your beaver dam. So I do not agree with the kind of Marxist Leninist idea that property is sort of a recent cultural invention. I think it runs really, really deep in animal behavior.
Yes.
And when, like one of my mentors at University of Sussex was John Maynard Smith, the evolutionary game theorist. And he did a bunch of papers showing that even for simple animals, if you kind of run the game theoretic modeling about what happens if there's a conflict between like an animal that has a territory and an invading animal that wants the territory, you often get a situation where sort of property is 9/10 of the law. Like if the animals assume that the animal that's already there kind of has a stronger claim to the territory than the new animal, that actually helps you avoid a lot of pointless conflict,
right,
and injury and death that would otherwise result. So I would not I don't know to what extent animal psychologists have looked into do chimps or beavers or other animals have a kind of intuitive sense of property rights. But I would be really surprised if they didn't. And I think you're right that money is sort of the an abstraction of that. And I just think of money as liquid fitness. Right? Money is something that you can trade for any other form of fitness that might be useful to you, whether it's food or territories or mates or childcare or protection or a better social network or whatever.